And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Radio Network here, well, at coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at coalition_radio. The mothership, the original website at coalitionradio.us, where nearly 7, 8, who knows how many years of interviews, including some guy named Gary Johnson, I don't know where he came from, exist as sort of a monument for that generation. This is, of course, Coalition 3.0, operating out of our own little studio here high above the hills in Providence, Rhode Island. Folks, if I sound pumped, if I sound excited right now, it is because there is no greater challenge, no greater issue, if you will, to the libertarian nation and the nation at large than ending wars in our time. And if that smacks of sort of an early 20th century, 19th century former president who was actually a disaster, I apologize for that. But ultimately, we want to end the next war now. But before we do that, we as a nation have to start to address the tragedies that we foment in and of ourselves in our own volition, not some artificially indicted bogeyman that our government will indict for us and present to us as a true evil, while maintaining this sort of squalid misinformation that we are pure of heart here in the United States. That is the challenge that we must face. There are 2 or 3 seminal issues that we face as a nation. Number one, ending the war on drugs, which, as I like to point out, will have the effect of pulling the alarm and ending so many tragedies happening simultaneously around the world. But alongside of that is ending the notion that America has to be engage in state-sponsored terrorism of the worst kind, and we do. And we do so in the pursuit of the almighty dollar on behalf of the military-industrial complex here in the United States. People are dying. We are droning the liberty into nations. And as one wag pointed out, and I'm paraphrasing, but he pointed out, a gentleman from the Middle East pointed out, he said he feels so much better that a more woke, culturally sensitive administration has been promoted here in the United States, so that if he's going to get bombed and droned, at least it's by people who are woke. and wow, there's a lot to unravel in that. So it is with great joy, as someone hosting an independent media network, that I reintroduced someone to our audience who is by now, because of his appearance tonight, is officially a repeat offender. Of course, is Scott Horton. Scott is the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, host of Anti-War Radio on Pacifica in LA, California. He podcasts one of the most important, podcasts in America right now, and that is the Scott Horton Show. His website is scotthorton.org. He's the author of a new book, Enough Already, The Time to End the War on Terrorism. In 2019, the great Ron Paul, the Scott Horton Show interviews from 2004 to 2019, and a tome that came out in 2017 that literally has changed the perspective of an entire generation of libertarians in how, and quite frankly, the country at large, and how they look at war. All right, and of course, that is the book Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan. He appeared here in Rhode Island just a couple of years ago at the Liberty Forum, sponsored by your Libertarian Party of Rhode Island, where I had the opportunity to meet him for the first time. You want more? His articles have appeared in antiwar.com, the American Conservative Magazine, the History News Network, the National Interest, and the Christian Science Monitor. He also contributed a chapter to the 2019 book short for the impact of war. But more, he's director of the Libertarian Institute, the editorial director at antiwar.com, and of course, he's the host of the Scott Horton Show and Anti-War Radio. Scott Horton, welcome back to the Coalition. I can't tell you, on one sense, I'm so excited to have you here to have this conversation, to engage in what I've called an education in Yemen, or Yemen 101. At the same time, it's been 3 years since we last met, and the tragedy that so many of the conditions exist, despite your effort and the effort of so many people of goodwill, despite those are still going on, is a profound tragedy. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Pat, for that great introduction. It's great to be back on your show with you here. And you're certainly right about the war in Yemen. It's as bad as Iraq War II or Syria, only with 1/100th of the coverage of those disasters.
Let's start from that in a sense, and then I because we're calling this Yemen 101. And by the way, I hope we have you back in a couple of weeks when we can actually focus completely on your new book. It's an important book. I've been posting it for a week or two now on the Coalition website to give you an opportunity and a link to purchase it. But let's start with, before we go into a history, why? When you look on, America's and Western Europe's intense focus on human tragedy, and I'm going back. I'm old enough to remember, the division of Southwest Asia and the horrors in if you will, in Southwest Asia of starvation. I'm old enough to remember what happened in Ethiopia. So many of these tragedies were at least covered sympathetically by popular media and the press. Why is there seemingly a blackout of news on Yemen?
Oh, that's such a great way to frame it. Of course, it's because it's the USA's fault, right? If this was in Ethiopia in the 1980s, you have Michael Jackson and Bob Dylan and Cyndi Lauper all holding hands across America to raise money to save the people. And that was because Ethiopia was at that time under the control of, American-backed communist dictator. I'm not sure if America backed him right in 1984 or not, but it certainly wasn't a war like this. And if it was the Americans, there was communists, I guess. Oh, no. See, the Soviets backed the communists in Ethiopia. The Americans backed the communists in Somalia next door. Sorry, I got that reversed for a second there. Both communists in the Cold War. But because it was a Soviet-allied country in Ethiopia, that was good PR for Michael Jackson and Cyndi Lauper to do Hands Across America to save the poor people. And even then, they never explained why they're so hungry. Sam Kinison had a great routine about, you live in the desert, move. Right. But that wasn't it. It was politics. Right. They lived in a totalitarian dictatorship that had rounded them up onto these so-called collective farms, prison camps, and they were starving. So anyway, the reason there's no coverage of Yemen when they could make a cause out of it. Right. If Bashar al-Assad was the one responsible for the situation in Yemen, or if somehow they could pin it on Vladimir Putin, then they would do that. In fact, they have a whole narrative that the reason we're doing what we're doing there is because of Iran, but they don't even dare to pretend that, okay, yes, there's a famine, but let's blame it all on Iran, because it's not Iran that's waging that war. If Iran's guilty of anything, it's supporting the people that we're waging the war against with minimal effort, but nothing like the amount of aid that America is giving Saudi Arabia. And so, to be clear, and from the very beginning here, this is what the Obama government called leading from behind, right? Remember that in Libya? Well, we're going to have everybody else do the dirty work, which wasn't even really true in that case. America had all the planes and all the bombs to carry out that 9-month war in Libya. But they made it look like this isn't a U.S.-led mission. We're just supporting our allies in what they're doing. And so that's the same thing here. They still, to this day, after 6 years straight, they call it the Saudi-led coalition, even though, of course, it's the U.S. that is the world empire and Saudi Arabia that is our client state. And, of course, our other close ally, Great Britain, plays another major role in supporting the war. But as anyone would agree who knows anything about this, any level of expert on the story whatsoever would agree that the Saudis cannot wage this war without the U.S. and the U.K.'s help. Simple as that. So, in other words, any day of the week, Donald Trump could have said, turn the war off. That's it. It's over. And it would have been over. Same thing for Joe Biden today. He could have ended it on January the 20th, the 21st, 22nd, 23rd. What is it, the 28th now? Right. All he has to do is say the word. He doesn't even have to pick up a pen.
Yeah. And yet, he's appointed to be the defense director, Secretary of Defense, literally a C-suite occupant of Raytheon, which is one of the criminal, if you will, combatants in Yemen as we speak. I mean, they have made an inordinate amount of money off of a level of human suffering that is astonishing to have happened in the year 2021.
And not only that, but they have blatantly, just like if you were just to make up the accusation about how you bet it probably works, Raytheon has lobbied like crazy to keep this war going. When Congress passed the War Powers Resolution to try to force Trump to stop it, which is the first time in history it had ever been invoked, and he vetoed it, that was because of direct lobbying by Raytheon working with Pete Navarro, Trump's trade guy, who, look, you guys are ruining all our trade with China, screwing up the agricultural sector and manufacturing and all of these things, disrupting all these sectors. But so who can we pay off in manufacturing to give a boost and get our numbers up? And that is, we can shovel money directly into the military industrial complex. So Saudis pay up to keep, Raytheon in the black. And then of course, they're the same people who will say, hey, listen, all we do is provide the munitions for the missions that our elected democratic political leaders decide must be done. We don't have any role in determining the policy, when that's just not true. The whole thing is essentially just a racket. It's a con, and people are dying. And in fact, so you asked about Lloyd Austin, our new Secretary of Defense. As you say, he just came from the board of Raytheon, where he was getting paid. Well, before that, he was a 4-star general in command of Central Command. And in fact, this is a big deal. Donald Trump had to get a waiver from Congress to be allowed to appoint a former general to Secretary of Defense, because that job had only ever gone, it said in the law, if any military officer is to be the Secretary of Defense, he has to have been out of that job, out of the military, for at least 7 years, to try to remain, even though we are an empire, to try to maintain a semblance of civilian control over the military. But they gave a waiver to Donald Trump and James Mattis, because they thought if they got Mad Dog Mattis, the general there, to keep a leash on Trump, it would be worth it to do that. Well, now the precedent is set, so they just turn right around and pass another waiver for Joe Biden, the next president, to also have a military officer, a 4-star general, just 4 years out of power, to come in and be his Secretary of Defense. And he had to get a waiver from the Congress in order to do that. But let's put a mark in this, Pat, because we're going to tell the story of the Yemen war. Right. And right at the major turning point of the Yemen war, General Lloyd Austin plays a major role, which we'll get to, here in just a moment.
So let's, if you will, and by the way, if you're just joining us, Scott Horton, and if you're a libertarian, when you hear the word Scott Horton, you again, it's with great mixed emotion, because Scott is one of the preeminent activists, authors, podcasters, broadcasters, conversationalists, and if you will, keeper of the keys, if I can use that term, because ultimately the attention to detail here and how things actually happened, as opposed to urban legends and the Screaming Eagles tattooed on the backs of people who are, going to drone the liberty into people, is a critical component, because if we are to remain intellectually honest on these issues, we need a Scott Horton. He's joining us tonight to give us a lesson in what I call Yemen 101. This show, this platform, is going to wreak holy rage up here in New England on the folks who would try to disguise this as either just a move for trade imbalances, who are going to disguise this as a civil war. Sorry, not going to happen. We are going to war to end the war here at the Coalition. So how did this all begin? You've got divisions in the Islamic world. You've got, Americans using the bogeyman, Saudis with their own interests. Tell us the truth, Scott Horton. How did we get into this mess? Oh, did we lose Scott? Hang on a second.
Oh, I'm sorry. My bad. I turned it off when I was coughing, and I forgot to turn it back on again.
Okay. No worries.
I'm sorry about that. I tell the whole story in the book Fool's Errand, not to be, enough already, not to be too bad of a salesman about it, but there's a chapter in there on Yemen. And the common thread, of course, through the whole book is all of this story has its origin in Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan's war in Afghanistan in the 1980s, when they worked with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan to funnel Islamist fighters of all different descriptions from all across the Middle East and Central Asia and even the United States to go and fight the communists, the Soviet Union. And then that was the group that really blew back. It turned into Al-Qaeda and blew back against us. And then, but the seeds of Islamist insurrectionary type movements from the Philippines to, Saudi and Yemen and Egypt and all over the place really came blowing back from that war in Afghanistan, including Al-Qaeda, that then turned against the United States and attacked us, including on September 11th. Now, in Yemen, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, as it's now called, is real Al-Qaeda. And these are the guys who bombed the USS Cole in the year 2000. They're the guys who tried to blow up the plane over Detroit with the underpants bomb in 2009 and did the printer package plot in 2010. And they did the Charlie Hebdo massacre of the cartoon magazine in Paris, France in 2015. And I think it was one of the other French massacres. I forget if it was the Nice massacre or the Eagles of Death Metal concert massacre there. That was also done by AQAP. So these are, sometimes our government will say, well, this group has links to Al-Qaeda, and they're kind of exaggerating because they want to get away with something. In this case, these are real Al-Qaeda guys. In fact, they had a role in helping to coordinate the September 11th attack on the United States. Okay. Mm-hmm. So Bush, W. Bush did 1 or 2 drone strikes against them there, including killed an American citizen, but it was kind of his fault because he was running around with some Al-Qaeda guys, was apparently not the target of the strike. So, okay. And otherwise, Bush basically outsourced the rest of the war on terrorism, the rest of the war against Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, to the dictator of Yemen, a guy named Abdullah Saleh. Okay. So that's where Barack Obama picks up in 2009. Barack Obama comes in and he tells the CIA, I want to have a real drone war against Al-Qaeda. Forget all the distraction stuff. We'll get to that later. But for now, we want to really focus on killing all of Osama bin Laden's last of his friends anywhere in the world that they are. And we're going to, especially in Pakistan, where they're hiding out with the Tariqi Taliban, and in Yemen. So he makes a deal with the dictator of Yemen. And this is a guy that had been backed by the Americans for 30 years since 1991. And, well, by that time, 20 years. He made a deal with Abdullah Saleh that we'll give you all this money and guns if you will allow us to wage a CIA drone war to kill Al-Qaeda guys in the south of the country. I should say for your audience, especially listening on the radio, does everybody picture the Arabian Peninsula? It's this big rectangle tilted hard to the northwest, right? And we're talking about the very southwest corner of the Arabian Peninsula here at the gate of the Red Sea, across from the Horn of Africa, across from Somalia. It's called the Bab al-Mandeb. There is the gate of the Red Sea that leads to the Mediterranean, right? In other words, on the far side of Arabia from the Persian Gulf. Okay. So now Obama starts paying this dictator, Saleh, to allow him to bomb AQAP with the drones. Now, they say that this is a surgical strike and that this is a scalpel. A drone is a scalpel. But really, of course, they're dropping 500-pound bombs on people. They're killing innocent people all the time. And that, even according to Stanley McChrystal, it's insurgent math. The more you bomb them, the more enemies you make. And especially when you kill innocent civilians, then you have people who have no part of the fight whatsoever join up and become part of it. So the whole time that the CIA is bombing Al-Qaeda in the south there, it's basically, watering a terrorist garden with blood and just growing AQAP greater and greater with all the collateral damage. Okay, so put that aside for a second. Now, Abdullah Saleh, he's the dictator. He takes all the money and the guns, and he attacks his enemies, a group of Shiites in the north of the country called the Houthis. Now, every time he attacks them, it also backfires. They get more and more powerful. He invades up there in the north of the country about 6 different times, 5-6 different times. And each time they get more and more powerful, beating back his attempts to fight them. And in fact, he's playing a double game, and he's using Al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood against them. In fact, he's playing a triple game, and he's actually funneling weapons to the Houthis to use against his own army and the Muslim Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda in order to wear them out, since they're getting too powerful. So Yemeni politics, it's a bloody mess. Anyway, so this is the status quo. America's waging a counterproductive war in the south against Al-Qaeda. Their pet dictator Saleh is waging a counterproductive war in the north against the Houthis. Okay, but then comes the Arab Spring in 2011, the peaceful democratic revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt that, of course, went to hell, but especially in Egypt. But at that time, there were Day of Rage protests broke out all across the region, and virtually all different political factions converged on the capital city to demand the end of the Saleh regime. And they had all different plans for writing a new constitution and creating parliaments and all these kinds of things. But then somebody tried to kill Saleh, and he was wounded in the attack. And so he had to go to Saudi Arabia to convalesce. And while he was there in receiving medical treatment, Hillary Clinton, America's Secretary of State under Obama, she came in and made a deal with the Saudi princes that what we're going to do is we're going to do a soft coup against Abdullah, force him out, and replace him with his vice president, Hadi. Well, here's the problem, Pat, is that Saleh did not retire to his farm to a quiet life of study. Instead, he said, oh, yeah, you can't fire me. I quit. And he took about 2/3 of the army with him. And then what'd he do? He went north and he made an alliance with the Houthis. It turns out he's a Zaydi Shiite just like them, even though he's not a Houthi, but close enough. And so they made an alliance. Meanwhile, American Saudi Arabia's installed puppet dictator Hadi is really lousy at being a dictator. And he's not able to really, assemble the coalition of different tribes and factions that he needs to maintain power. And he cancels the supposed elections that he was supposed to hold and never really stood for a fair election. And he kept picking a fight with the Houthis, which just the same as when Saleh tried it, it kept backfiring on him. Now, here's where we get to the bad part, okay? The end of 2014, the Saleh Houthi alliance marches down out of the north of the country and they take over the capital city. They run Hadi, the new president, out of power down to Aden and then eventually out of the country to Riyadh, where he's been hiding ever since. They keep calling him the government, but he's not. And the Houthis took over the capital. All right. Now, here's where we get back to Lloyd Austin, who was then the commander of Central Command before he was a Raytheon board member, before he became our new Secretary of Defense under Joe Biden. At that time, he made a deal with the Houthis. Hey, you guys like killing Al-Qaeda guys? And the Houthis said, yeah, we like killing Al-Qaeda. And the Al-Qaeda guys like killing them. The Al-Qaeda guys consider these Houthis to be the worst kind of heretics, deserving of death and all of this stuff. So the Houthis are like, yeah, you want to help us kill them? And the Americans said, yes, let's kill them together. And so you can read this in the Wall Street Journal. It's January the 28th, 2015. And there's another one from, I think, a couple of days before. They're both from January 2015. And this one is in Al Monitor. And it's by Barbara Slavin, the reporter who is also a member of the Atlantic Council. And she's covering a meeting at the Atlantic Council where the Deputy Secretary of Defense for Intelligence, Michael Vickers, shows up at the Atlantic Council and gives a whole presentation explaining that we are working with the Houthis to pass intelligence to them to use to kill Al-Qaeda guys for us. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that was great, but anyway, at least they were targeting those who had shed innocent American blood. Okay. And that was Lloyd Austin that had made that call and was doing that. But then, Pat, 2 months later, Barack Obama turned around and stabbed the Houthis in the back, and he took Al-Qaeda's side against them. Okay? And so let's catch up. America has a drone war in the South against Al-Qaeda, which only grows them. We bribe the dictator to let us do it. He takes the money and guns we give him. He picks a fight with the guys in the north that grow more and more powerful, the Houthis, who grow more and more powerful in resisting him. Then when the Arab Spring comes, America and Saudi ease him out for his vice president, but he resents it and goes and joins the alliance in an alliance with the Houthis in the north and come down to take the capital city. The American generals say, fine, what do we care if a bunch of Shiites take the capital city? We'll work with them to kill Al-Qaeda guys. That's our only business in Yemen. Okay. But then Obama takes Al-Qaeda's side. 2 months later, March 2015. Why? Because that's what Saudi Arabia demanded. And why is that what Saudi Arabia demanded? That's what Saudi Arabia demanded because they basically had an emotional problem. They needed to be made to feel better about the fact that the Barack Obama government was then working on and was obviously ready to sign a nuclear deal with Iran. Now, that's kind of funny, right? Because if the Saudis were concerned about an Iranian nuclear weapon, then you would think the nuclear deal was a pretty good deal for them because it locked down the Iranian civilian nuclear program far more than ever before, expanded inspections and all of these things, and guaranteed that they're in no way a double guaranteed beyond any verification and inspection regime in history that Iran's civilian nuclear program would remain civilian and not be turned into a nuclear weapons program. But of course, the Iranian nuclear bomb was always a hoax. The Saudis were never worried about that any more than the Israelis or the Americans were. They were lying to you about that. That wasn't the problem. The problem was the Saudis thought that if Obama made a deal with Iran on the nuclear program, that would take the major issue of tension between us off the table, not only reducing the threat of war, but possibly opening up the opportunity for a real rapprochement and new relationship between the U.S. and Iran. And then that would jeopardize Saudi Arabia's place as number one, right, in America's dominated order in the Middle East.
Right.
And so as the Obama people told the am I on? The video's freezing up here a little. We good?
No, you're good. You're good.
Are we good, Pat?
Yeah, no, you're good.
Okay. As the Obama people explained to the New York Times, okay, I just want to make sure. As the Obama people explained to the New York Times, we had to placate the Saudis. They knew the war, they said, would be long, bloody, and indecisive. And think about that. Indecisive. Okay, it's just a word on paper, but what does that mean? Indecisive. It means they knew that they didn't know what victory was even supposed to look like. They couldn't even define it for you. They didn't think that the war would be a success. They didn't know what a success would even be. But they said, okay, we have to just start it anyway, and we'll just figure that out later. As George W. Bush said about Iraq, well, other presidents will have to figure that out, right? And Obama will just leave it to Hillary or the next guy to figure out what to do. And so they just started the war. And of course, also, the now infamous Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, the guy who murdered the Washington Post reporter and cut him up with a bone saw, infamously. At that time, Pat, he was the 29-year-old brand new deputy Crown Prince and defense minister, and just appointed. And he launched this war for his own, call it public choice theory, right? Government, there's no national interest in Saudi Arabia. There's just the interest of individual princelings and bureaucrats. And in this case, it was good politics for him to start a war against this group of Shiites who had taken over this city, the capital city of Yemen. And it worked for him. He moved up in status. He arrested his cousin, Mohammed bin Nayef, and who had been the crown prince, and marginalized him and named himself crown prince and is de facto king of Saudi Arabia right now, because his father, King Salman, is like 85 and senile and just has to read his lines off an iPad. And so it's the boy who's in charge. And this is how he solidified his position inside the royal regime there. And so by launching this war. And then, of course, long, bloody, and indecisive. They called it Operation Decisive Storm. Well, what we're going to do, we're just going to go right in there and bomb them. It's going to be great. Well, and part of their excuse, a major part of their excuse, is that the Houthis are friends with Iran. They're backed by Iran. And so if they win, if they control that, oh no, it'll be like Hezbollah on Saudi's southern border and all this. But they're just friends with Iran. In fact, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy type situation where they're now much closer to Iran than they've ever been before. It wasn't until 2019, 4 years into the war, that the Ayatollah invited the head Houthi to come and be recognized as the official government of Yemen, years into the war. As Barack Obama himself admitted on camera, the Iranians warned the Houthis to not take the capital city. Don't do it, because you're just going to provoke a war by the Saudis. They'll never accept it. Don't push your luck. And they did it anyway over the Iranians' objections. And so, the Iranians are not really the reason for it. And they're certainly not the power behind the Houthis in any real sense. And even though they're a marginal faction of the country, once the country's attacked by foreigners, everybody rallies around them, right? It's just like George W. Bush didn't represent every faction in America, but boy, did people rally around him when somebody came and knocked our towers down, right? You know, we're all W. Bush now, cried the liberal Democrats and that kind of thing. Well, it's the same thing there, where people who are not the Houthis and have never had a reason to support the Houthis support them now because they're the group that happens to be in charge of the government that they all share, and that is in charge of protecting their security from foreign onslaught. And it's really sad too, Pat, because when the Houthis took power, they weren't trying to create some new Houthi dictatorship. And Saleh didn't have the ability to do so, right? He was dependent on their goodwill, and they had plans. They were trying to drop constitutions to create an upper and a lower house of parliament, to give minority groups and women a voice in the lower house, and all of these kinds of things. They were working on a peace deal. They weren't, working on creating a Houthi, because they'd be crazy to, right? That wouldn't make any sense for this small Shiite faction to try to lord it as some authoritarian dictatorship and try to force their ways on the rest of the country and stuff like that. That's not how it works. So they were ready to share power. The Saudis had paid these Houthis off over the years to just not cause trouble. Why couldn't we just go back to that? We could have had that all along. We didn't have to have this war at all. And here's the thing of it. After 6 years of war, they're no closer to accomplishing their goals whatsoever. They're just not doing it. The Hadi government will never be the government of Yemen. That's, I think, rule number 1 or rule number 2 or something on St. Augustine's just war theory, right? Or Thomas Aquinas or whoever, the just war theory. The goals have to be achievable. If the goals aren't achievable, then you can't do it, period. That's the rule of Western civilization. And here we are, we're fighting a war that we know cannot achieve the stated end. Right. Long, bloody, and indecisive. And here we are after 6 years. And then here's the worst part, Pat. I saved the worst part, okay? The Saudis, with American and British help, are fighting this war like savage barbarians. And they are laying essentially a medieval siege campaign against the civilian population of the country. And with American help, they are bombing the waterworks, the sewage, the electricity, the hospitals. They bomb the farms. They bomb the trucks. At the farms, they bomb the grain silos, the flocks of sheep in the field, the irrigation ducts, and whatever they can, every bit of infrastructure. Then in downtown Sada, they bomb the car dealership. They bomb the potato chip factory. They bomb essentially any business of any import, of any economic value in the country at all. And especially in regards to the basic necessities of life: food, water, electricity, hospitals. And so people are laying down dying. They've had the worst cholera outbreaks in recorded history. And that includes worse than what George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton deliberately inflicted on the Iraqis through the exact same policy in 1990 through 2001, when they waged that campaign. The first of all bombed all of Iraq's civilian infrastructure, and then waged the sanctions and blockade campaign against them, and wouldn't allow them to have chlorine for their water in the name of chemical weapons. Lies. What a joke. But anyway, this is worse than that. This cholera epidemic, the cholera epidemics that have broken out in Yemen, about 4 of them over the last 6 years, have made Iraq pale in comparison. And this is a disease, Pat, that is actually really easily treatable with just clean water. Almost always, you don't even need antibiotics. You just need a steady supply of clean water, but they don't have it. And so they're dying by the thousands and thousands and thousands. And, the official numbers now are that 100,000 people have been killed. But I guarantee you, at the end of this thing, when they do the excess death rate and all that, it's going to be 500,000 people at least have died in this thing, maybe more than that. It's been going on this whole time. This is the poorest country in the Middle East. And you won't be surprised about this, libertarians, that because the IMF and the World Bank, through previous gangsterization schemes, had coerced and bribed and gotten one way or the other the Yemenis to abandon their sorghum and their millet and their other grains and sustenance crops in favor of coffee and cotton. that they could sell as cash crops. And then, hey, you'll be eating Florida oranges the day after tomorrow. Welcome to the world economy. It's great. You can diversify your diet and buy all this great food. Ever tried Brazilian beef? Oh man, have a steak. And yet, oops, yeah, once the USA puts you under a naval blockade, then now you're kicked right back out of the global economy again. But meanwhile, your farming's been decimated and all of your food fields have been turned into cotton fields that you can't do anything with. And so they were already about something like 80% to 90% dependent on foreign food imports at the time that the war started. And then by the accounting of every aid organization on the planet, this is the worst humanitarian crisis in the world 6 years running. And if anyone just puts in Yemen child into Google Images, that's all you need to know, my friends, right there. It's a genocide. It is a real, first of all, it's treason, backing the Saudi, UAE, Al-Qaeda coalition against the Houthis who never did anything to us. Okay. Well, and I'm not being a partisan here. It's Obama and Trump. And so first of all, it's treason. And second of all, it's genocide, real, no fooling genocide, a real campaign to starve the civilian population into the country into somehow what? Doing something about it? Overthrowing their government for us, which has never happened, will never work, cannot work, has not worked.
In the waning days of the Trump administration, they somehow managed to find a way to make it even worse, didn't they? And clarify this for me. The Trump administration decided to label or ascribe the label of terrorist organization to the Houthis, which effectively put a clamp down on any humanitarian aid whatsoever. What was the impact of that? I mean, that's you're talking about the basic. The orgs out there, and the NGOs out there, Doctors Sans Frontières, the organizations like that. All of a sudden, what happens to them once this organization is labeled a terrorist?
They're done. Just like Trump or Biden could do with a spoken word out loud, like flipping a switch, turn the war off. They turned the aid off. You put them on the terrorist, put the Houthis on the terrorist list. That means that none of the NGOs can deliver aid. Now, I don't know if the UN has a loophole for literal UN ships and UN officials or not. I don't presume that they do, but I hadn't heard about that. But essentially all of the aid organizations, and they scream bloody murder over it. Please don't do this. And then think about this, Pat. These Democrats, Biden swore, and his people all swore that they were going to end the war in Yemen. Even though Obama people said, like Robert Malley, who's going to be his new special emissary for Yemen or whatever, or for Iran, is going to be his job. Malley wrote a thing a couple of years ago about how, man, we wish we hadn't started that Yemen war. And it's believable too. He's like, God, this thing is just an atrocity. And geez, when we started it, we didn't think we were starting such a stupid, horrible thing. I mean, I'm not saying it's forgivable, but I'm saying it is believable that you can understand the guy's point of view, that he really wishes it wasn't this way. So they know better. And then as you just put it, Pat, this isn't like a long-standing policy. Mike Pompeo just made this up 2 weeks ago, right? They floated it for a few weeks before that. And then Mike Pompeo, on his last week in office, declared that this is the case. And then what did the Obama people do? The Biden people do? They come in and they say, well, we're going to begin to review that. Well, what's to review? You know that Pompeo just made it up a couple of days ago, and you all know better. And every NGO in the world is screaming bloody murder about this. Just undo it. Undo it. And meanwhile, if they're reviewing whether possibly to take the Houthis back off the terrorist designation list, then that also reveals by relief then that they're not ending the war. If they were ending the war, then and we're taking them off the terrorist list would be a side statement from that, right? That would be a detail,
right,
of we're calling this war off. We're not doing this. But you know what, too, though, and I'm not one to give credit to politicians in any particular way, but it is the case that some Republicans and Democrats in the House and the Senate really do care a lot about this. And there are really, really great activists on the ground in Washington, D.C., who have been beating the pavement with their shoe rubber and shoe leather for years on this. And especially the Friends Committee on National Legislation, the Quakers, and a bunch of other groups have really been working hard on this. And the progressive California Democrat, Ro Khanna, is essentially the leader in the House and who has promised, and he better hurry the hell up, he's promised to reintroduce the bill for the War Powers Act to force an end to this thing. Oh, there was one more detail, was they said they were reviewing arms sales. They suspended arms sales to UAE and Saudi. But then check this out. They go, wait, though, we're not doing that because of Yemen. That's just a standard operating procedure type thing that a new administration does sometimes, is just pause things and review them, which maybe they were just trying to play it down and it really was about Yemen, but it wasn't a very good take coming from them. They do the right thing and immediately clarify that it's for the wrong reason or for no good reason really at all. So in other words, if they change their mind, don't be surprised. It sounds like what they're setting us up for here.
Right.
And, you know, there's just no good reason for it other than the Saudis buy a lot of American debt, but I don't care. Screw them.
This past Monday was it was sort of an international event. It was a global day of action. We're to stop the war in Yemen. And to your point, the American Friends Society, amongst the leadership of really an international coalition that to observe this both on the web digitally as well as in real time. Here in nearby Massachusetts, there are a number of organizations got together, to their credit, and established protests. And you could see almost Americans looking confused. And again, the congressman was right out in front, reasserting the fact that there will be action. We'll just let that hang. We can only hope. But what was telling is that, again, to echo one of the themes of tonight, there was no coverage of this whatsoever. If this was a global day to honor, I don't know, Michael Jackson and his evolution of the moonwalk, you would have had a bigger turnout in the media. There was a collective yawn. I could find literally nothing in New England. And understand that New England is a bastion of, if you will, of the liberal movement, of allegedly the anti-war movement, Code Pink. And I'm not going to indict any one organization. The failure was consummate. The failure was complete. The inaction, the ignorance was astonishing. In for this international crisis, that again. If you look to what's the old line? I have seen the enemy and he is us. That's exactly what's happening. Has anyone ever tried to, and this is sort of an unfair question, but because it's tough to really pinpoint this. How much money do you think Raytheon and organizations like that have made on the bodies of the dead in Yemen? Any idea?
Oh, I mean, it's not very much, tens of billions.
No.
In other words, absolute chump change when it comes to the American economy, right? Donald Trump liked to say, oh, the Saudis are spending $450 billion on weapons. Millions of jobs depend on it. What a bunch of crap. Who could possibly believe such a ridiculous lie? The Saudis spend about $10 billion a year, which is a lot if you're Raytheon and you get to cash a check for $3 billion every year. Okay. But that's not, and maybe it even is for a couple of towns where Raytheon is based. I don't know. Raytheon has facilities in Austin, Texas. And I think if they packed up and went bankrupt and dissolved tomorrow, I don't think anyone would notice whatsoever. Right. I don't think even the coffee shop across the street would suffer. So the idea that our economy is dependent on them. Donald Trump just has to add decimal places to just make believe that somehow millions of jobs are dependent. And then think about this too, that, and I don't, I'm not, believe me, and I think you guys can tell, I'm not some anti-Trump partisan. I'm an anti-everybody partisan. And I'm not saying that Barack Obama is any better in any way, but for Donald Trump to simply just announce that America is simply a collection of mercenaries who murder people for money, who have no ethics, who don't even know what ethics are. We are all just a bunch of idiot narcissists like him who care only about ourselves, who couldn't give a damn how many Yemeni babies starve to death as long as a couple of Joe Lunchbox gets to cash a check for helping to put some screws in a cruise missile. And and our whole society just accepts that. Donald Trump believes that is who we are, liberty and justice for all and all this crap. No, we're just a ranch where, between Canada and Mexico, where Israeli grows their infantry and where, engineers put together weapons for the Saudis to use against babies. And that's what we're doing here even. That's the secret of life. Why are we here? We're mercenaries. We serve His Royal Highness, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the bonesaw murderer.
Right.
According to Donald J. Trump, president of America's oldest limited constitutional republic.
And if it's critical to point out when you talk about inspiring terrorism, inspiring a reaction, that while America may not be watching, the rest of the world is, aren't they?
That's right. I mean, and people call me out about this and say, oh, we hate the moralizing. That's it. I like your names and dates, Horton, but once you start telling me what's right and wrong, you kind of bug me. But this bugs me, Pat, right? This is my country. I'm a Texan. I'm a patriot. This is my America. And this is the history of the world being written. This is what we have done, like it or not. And you know what? It ain't fair, is it? But English is a very communist language, and it's full of we's and us's and these sort of collective terms for our action. And we're all brainwashed from the time we're in first grade that because America's a democracy and because we have free speech, because the adults like to talk about politics and figure out what's right and vote for their best representative to go and make the best decisions and vote for honorable men to be their presidents and make these calls to protect us, that somehow this is all great. Somehow this all goes without question. We're just supposed to allow this to continue on when the reality is that people just stop and think about it. They know better, right? We've all seen Rambo 3. Every single person listening to this show right now knows these guys used to work for Ronald Reagan. Hell, these guys used to work for Bill Clinton before they turned on us during W. Bush. This whole terror war long has been a fraud. And it's time for people to grow up and wake up and stop feeling like they need to believe in this. Who's pressuring you to believe in this anymore? Huh? After Donald J. Trump, the Republican president of the United States, said that George Bush going to the Middle East was the worst decision any American president ever made. Well, what else do you need? If that's the official position of the American right, then who else is left to believe in this stuff anymore?
What's happened, if you will, to the anti-war movement in America? I'm privileged to live here in Rhode Island, where in nearby Massachusetts, where there are a number of committed individuals who literally are out there, often made sport of because of their diminished numbers. These people are, some of them are doing it on a religious basis, others are doing it on a moral basis, all of which is a thoroughly legitimate approach to this. What's happened to the rest of the anti-war movement? Where is the outrage?
Yeah, well, man, it's a mess. Back during World War II and before World War II, it was really the conservatives, or not really the conservatives, but it was the right who opposed the New Deal and World War II, at least until Pearl Harbor, And then after World War II, it was the conservative right led by, what's his name? Robert Taft. I always want to say William Howard, but that's his great uncle or whatever. Robert Taft, Senator Robert Taft, and that wing, the kind of Midwestern conservative wing of the Republican Party. But then that whole narrative about, well, we should be a republic, not an empire, and we should husband our resources, and we should help the French build their army back up to keep the Reds out, but we don't need to have our troops. We don't need NATO, and we don't need American troops permanently deployed in Europe and all these things. that kind of went away because all the leaders of that part of the movement died. And the right was really replaced by Conservatism, Inc., led by the National Review magazine and the neoconservatives, the first generation of neoconservatives, meaning ex-communists who turned into right-wingers and anti-Soviet hawks in the Cold War. And sort of that kind of more libertarian type anti-war movement leadership was sort of gone, but in the era between Korea and Vietnam. Then with Vietnam, there were anti-war right-wingers, but certainly they were outnumbered by far by the hippies and the new left of the anti-war left kind of movement. Mm-hmm. And, their heart was in the right place, but essentially, unintentionally, they tarred the anti-war movement forever with tie-dye and day glow and big stupid bubble letters and weird, fads that have to do with this summer of love kind of era that doesn't have anything to do with anti-war anything really at all. But they kind of, the new left kind of got so married to the anti-war movement that, their weaknesses helped to drag down the anti-war movement, as much credit as they should get for all the hard work and great work that they did do. But you see where even 50 years later, people bring up Jane Fonda inadvertently sitting on a I don't know how inadvertently, but momentarily anyway, sitting on a North Vietnamese anti-aircraft gun. And then the idea is that you have to support the troops or else you're spitting on the soldiers and all these things. So the American right, especially in the era of George W. Bush, were just, essentially browbeaten especially on that spitting on the soldiers narrative, that to support the troops means to support the war. How badly would the soldiers' feelings be hurt, Pat, if they knew that you were against the mission that they were on? How can you do that to them? And that was the way that they phrased it. They got away with that for a very long time. Right. But on the other hand, though, the Democrats had a big partisan incentive in the Bush years to oppose the wars. And because not just because it was the Republicans, but it was these Texas oil men in a war in the Middle East. It was a very easy narrative to sell to Democrat voters that this is corrupt, this is wrong. And after all, Iraq didn't have a thing to do with September 11th or threaten us in any way whatsoever. Saddam Hussein, as we found out later from his CIA interrogator, was semi-retired and writing a romance novel at the time, far from planning an attack on the United States. But sorry, me and my tangents. But so then Cindy Sheehan came and the left rallied around Cindy Sheehan. Her son was killed in Iraq on a stupid mission fighting the Shia where he should have never been in Sadr City in the first place in 2004. And this poor woman was, this tortured soul, lost her son over this lies on lies. And then the liberals rallied around her, not just the anti-war leftists with real principle, but the liberals rallied around her so that they could climb into the House of Representatives on her back. And that was what happened, was the Democrats took the House and the Senate back in 2006. And then your listeners, the attentive ones, will remember Pelosi immediately dropped the Iraq war. She wanted nothing to do with it. So there's no way in the world we're impeaching George Bush. I don't care if he did lie us into war. It's off the table. Before, that was still in the fall, before they were even sworn in as the new majority. Forget it. There's going to be no accountability here whatsoever. And if Bush wants to double the war instead of end it, fine, we'll fund that as long as they'll give us a bunch of, welfare money to give to buy off our constituents back in our districts. And so that's what happened in the spring of 2007. The Democrats sold out the anti-war movement entirely, gave Bush all the money that he wanted for the doubling of the war and the giant failed surge that just made the whole thing that much worse. And then the liberals, who have no principle at all, but who are essentially just the slaves of the Democratic Party and do and think whatever they're told, they didn't think about war again after that. Not one bit. And when Barack Obama came in 2008, well, that was their excuse, was, Obama's better on war. We love him. But they didn't really care if he was better on war or not. They just liked that as good salesmanship for him. And they thought he was a, more compelling character than Hillary Clinton. So they tried to hype up his anti-war credentials. But then once he got in there and started escalating the war in Yemen, in Somalia, in Afghanistan, and then in Libya and in Syria and then Iraq War III, they didn't have a word to say about it because he's their guy. And so partisanship just killed it. And the Republicans were still hawks. The Republicans were still, loyal to whatever George Bush told them to think. And it wasn't until at the end of that, well, Ron Paul did have his effect in helping shake that loose in 8 and 12. But, still in the major effect, the right wing of America, I mean, the Republican base, the Tea Party Republican voter base of America, were still pro-war until Donald Trump came to town. And then he had to beat Jeb Bush over the head with it to make sure to win the nomination. Jeb was the strongest candidate he faced. And so he just went right after him and said, you're the brother of the guy that got us into Iraq, which was the worst thing that ever happened anywhere ever, as far as I know. And then, this is a miracle, and this is a real turning point. This is huge. Was in the campaign of 2015, Trump in the debate in South Carolina said, Bush lied us into war. And then somebody said, hey, you take that back. I fought in that war. And he goes, okay, well, maybe they didn't lie us into war, but I mean, kind of, or something like that. He backed down a little, but still. Well, the next day, he won 2/3 of the vote. And the other 17 Republicans shared the other 1/3. And that was not in spite of Donald Trump saying anti-war things. That was Donald Trump in the most militarized, right-leaning, conservative state in the union, with, I think, more military bases per capita than any other state in the union, in South Carolina, where these men fought in the war and lost their brother in the war. And the war mattered to them, was real to them in a way that it's not to a lot of the country. And Donald Trump got up there and said, we should have never done that. Isn't that what we believe? Yeah. And the American right went with him on that. And that was the single greatest accomplishment of Donald Trump's presidency, is his psyop for good on the American right, in leading them to break from the George W. Bush legacy and to reject the idea that America is supposed to be, as the right usually calls it, the policeman of the world, responsible for righting every wrong in the world, the way that the liberals and the Democrats try to say. And then that's why they hated Trump so much, right? Is because not that he was really a non-interventionist or an isolationist or any of these things. He stayed at war 4 years. He didn't end a single war. He escalated every one that he inherited, right? But he didn't believe in the wars, and he didn't try to get you to believe in them. Mm-hmm. If you look at what Joe Biden wrote in his Foreign Affairs article a year ago, and if you listen to what he said just the other day, our commitment to NATO is sacred. It's sacred. This is the mystical, magical destiny of America. Apparently, I don't know. Does it say in your New Testament somewhere that 2,000 years from now, the middle part of North America shall be obligated to defend Eastern Europe from its no enemies that it has?
Right.
No. Right. Yeah, I'm sure. I've read that. I've read major parts of it, and I didn't stumble across that. But anyway, yeah. And so this is why they hated him so much, is for undermining, confidence in that mystical destiny. And this is what Biden and his people want to restore. And yet they're the ones who ruined everything. They clearly don't know better.
It's funny you bring up Trump. One of his great remarks, now forgotten because it doesn't fit the narrative, was when he alluded, and I'm paraphrasing here, but someone said something about, America, the great, the clean, the honorable. And he alluded to the fact that there's a lot of things that America's done that aren't so great and you wouldn't be proud of. And at the time, that drew a lot of attention. It's long since forgotten, but wow, was he right on that one? This notion that we've literally whitewashed our history of interventionism. And nowhere was that more clear, and completely unrelated to our conversation tonight. But when the Iranian general was executed by the Trump administration, you had an entire generation of Americans defending that, because they said, well, look what they did to us, with the hostage crisis, not even aware. It's not that they forgot. It's not that they were trying to obscure it, not even aware that America's issues with Iran began because of the CIA interventionism in the elections that were then led up to the Shah being reintroduced as the leader of Iran. That was really what was the seed for so much discontent, and to a large degree, even to today, The animus between
even if that wasn't
Iran
true,
and us.
right? Mm-hmm. Look, even if America had not overthrown Iran's democracy in 1953, but just they had taken some hostages back in 79, let's say that really was the first day in history. So what? Now you get to murder their top general in the year 2020?
Right.
Over a hostage crisis that broke out when I was in Briar Patch preschool?
Mm-hmm.
I was in the 3s, because when you're in preschool, they don't have grades. You're in the 3s and then you're in the 4s before you go into kindergarten. I was in the 3s during that hostage crisis. And what kind of tiny-brained little bootlicking servant of power could come up with a hollow excuse like that? Ronald Reagan sold the Ayatollah missiles 2 years later. They helped blow up the Beirut barracks in 1983. Ronald Reagan sold the missiles 6 months later through the Israelis. Oh, the Israelis are so afraid of Iran. But they stayed friends with Iran all through the 1980s during the mean old Ayatollah, right? The scary old Ayatollah, Khomeini, was their friend. They didn't turn on Iran. It wasn't Iran that turned on them. It was the Israelis who turned on Iran after the scary old Ayatollah was gone and the friendly new Ayatollah came with his friendly new president who wanted to make peace. And the Israelis would rather have a war, would rather pick a fight. People have got to be able to notice how hollow these excuses are. You know, oh, I heard Saddam Hussein has some mustard gas. Come on, you know Ronald Reagan bought him that mustard gas and helped him use it on the Iranians. Everybody knows that. Why are you pretending you don't know that? Why are you pretending that it's okay to start a war against a country for possibly possessing weapons that our country gave them 10 years ago to help them commit atrocities with? Give me a break.
But you bring
How
up,
could anyone not see through it?
Well, because, you know, and when I say this, it's not to point out that I'm so well educated, because I'm not. That's why I rely on folks like you to come on the show to really fill in all the gaps, and there are so many gaps. But we live in a society that fundamentally dumbed down the ongoing education of Americans, who works so hard to carry the water for a government informational complex, and seeks to diminish folks like us as being, quote unquote, you know, paranoid, or we're somehow, you know, disinformation or fake news or any one of the other, sloganism that's tossed our way to diminish facts, inconvenient as they may be. And that's the problem. That's the issue, is that it's terribly inconvenient for people to be aware of history. And as a result, we simply don't teach it. We don't teach civics. We don't teach history. And we certainly don't give a critical eye to the nonsense that's being taught our children. I'm blessed. My children attended a friend's school from K to 12. And then, one of them actually graduated from an Ivy League university's Middle Eastern Economic Studies program. You know, if I'm not exposed to that, if my children don't have the opportunity to learn Arabic at a freshman high school level, then I'm just kind of along for the ride like everybody else. I believe Americans deep down are wonderful people who are, quite frankly, some of the most charitable people on the planet. But ultimately, if they are not privy to, or have the time to, or able to analyze fundamental truths, then this is what happens. Again, we are more upset about the stupidity that happened at the Capitol building. The Democratic Party is fundraising off of the stupidity that happened at the Capitol building than literally one of the planet's worst genocides in history. There is an entire race, if you will, generation of population that is being effectively exterminated as we speak, in a time when we, as we should, acknowledge what happened in the 1940s and the 1930s. We acknowledge that. We say it should never happen again, as it shouldn't, and then we let it happen again. Not even we're the ones arming it.
I went off on my tangent there. I always get lost. I got what Biden's got these days, Pat. I swear, especially this late. But you're asking about the anti-war movement, right? And then so what happened was Trump was good for the anti-war movement in a way by helping turn the right anti-war, but then he stayed at war the whole time, right? And so now there's a real question of what's going to happen in the Biden years. The right typically, certainly if they follow their leaders in Congress, are going to go back to denouncing Biden for being weak and feckless and leaving America open to attack from our enemies and all these kinds of things, instead of being the warmongering imperialist pig that he is. So the question is, for the battle and assault right now, more than any other thing, of the American right, is Dan Crenshaw, aka John McCain Jr., this, know nothing war hawk, is he the leader of the American Republican Foreign Policy Caucus, or is there somebody else? Is it going to be Matt Gaetz, who's against this stuff and knows better and is much more, on the good side of Trumpianism there? Liz Cheney, who is the most dangerous person in America, probably, who was well on her way to becoming House Speaker, looks like she's toast now. The way she came out for Donald Trump, she's now got a 13% approval rating in Wyoming. I don't know if there's anybody prepared to defeat her, but the way she came out against Trump after the Capitol thing really hurt her. Thank God for that.
Right.
And she looks like, possibly that'll really jeopardize her position of leadership in the Republican Party. But that's where the fight is now. And Lord knows we need leftists to be hard on the liberals. If you're, good leftist anti-war people have to attack the liberals from the left constantly in order to force them to be less worse. Well, the American right, the anti-interventionists among the American right, now have a huge responsibility as the faction out of power to organize their dissent on anti-interventionist lines and anti-imperialist lines, and not let the war party twist the narrative into, oh no, the Chinese are coming, oh boo-hoo. And I saw some of these guys, they go from, yeah, Trump's great because he didn't start any wars and he kept us out of wars, and then they don't miss one beat. Biden's going to destroy Israel and sell us out to the Ayatollah in Beijing. No, he's not either. Biden works for Israel. Biden's always worked for Israel. He's not going to sell out America to Iran. Iran doesn't have any power to sell out to. Iran is nothing, okay? They're too big to attack and invade, but they're no threat to us in a million years. And the Cold War with China, you might have missed it, ended 50 years ago, when Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon went over there and shook hands with Mao Zedong, the world's greatest villain of all time, and said, you know what? It's better off. We're better off if we're friends instead of enemies. So let's do that. That was before I was even born, much less in preschool, was when we made peace with China. And now we're going to throw that away. Why? Because some lying jerk on TV says we have a problem. And then what? Are right wingers going to click their heels? Just like they demonized Saddam Hussein, just like they demonized Muammar Gaddafi and Bashar al-Assad and whoever, the Ayatollah, all these years. You're going to just pick on China now and pretend like they're a threat to us. Let me tell you what Iran's a threat to. This is in the new Woodward book, but it's a direct quote from Rex Tillerson, who was a friendly source. Rex Tillerson, who had been the CEO of Exxon and then was Trump's first Secretary of State, who willingly gave this quote to Bob Woodward, right? Not under duress or anything. It's not a disputed quote. It was a friendly interview like this one. And Rex Tillerson says to Bob Woodward, the threat of China is that they threaten American domination of the Pacific, right? Not they threaten America, not they threaten Oahu or even Guam, or our friends in Japan or Korea. They threaten American domination of the ocean itself. Right. Is the Pacific an American lake? Is it 100% an American lake or only 99? And the answer is find out the hard way if you think that we're going to settle for less than 100%. The Chinese are not threatening to close the South China Sea, to traffic. right, to naval or shipping traffic in any way. They're not doing anything to threaten America's friends and allies in the region. I mean, friends, maybe the Taiwanese, that's a whole other conversation, but there's not an imminent threat of war there. It doesn't seem like. And then speaking of Pompeo, making insane claims ratified shortly thereafter by Joe Biden's government. Pompeo was just announcing in November and December that America's war guarantee to Japan now extends to the Senkaku Islands, which aren't even islands. They're just rocks. They're islets, right? In the Pacific that the Chinese are building up to put landing strips there, small naval bases there. And these islands have been in dispute between Japan and China since time immemorial. I think actually Japan probably has a better claim on them, is my understanding. But the Pompeo said, yeah, America's war guarantee to Japan extends to these islands, these uninhabited islands. And then Biden's government comes in and says, yeah, that's right. We stand by that. And these guys are nuts.
Understand too that Pompeo is already beginning a shadow campaign for the presidency. Incredibly enough.
Yeah, that's going nowhere. He's got no charisma whatsoever. That's going nowhere. But now's the time for the American right to rally against Biden, calling him a hawk, calling him what he is, an imperialist and an interventionist who's trying to get us into a fight with a major power that we don't need. It doesn't matter if Donald Trump also told the same stupid lies. You don't have to go along with that because of partisanship. America doesn't have to fight anyone. Every major power on this planet is our friend. Every power in Europe is our friend. Russia is our friend. China is our friend. And that's it. That's it. Who else is left? India? Brazil? These are our friends who have no power at all. There's no power in Africa. There's no power in the Middle East. There's no power coming for us. We could just be a normal country in a normal time. We could just be a limited constitutional republic. The reason we have all these problems, Pat, is because we are the world empire, which we're never supposed to be.
Right. That certainly wasn't the plan of the quote-unquote founding fathers. In fact, the original plan was to, oppose essentially with our very lives and blood what we've become. And, I can use the euphemisms unfortunate, but again, let's and we've only got a couple minutes left, but let's go back to the original conversation. Google Yemen children. Just Google that, images. Just do a search and understand that the horrific views of what happened in Ethiopia, the incredible atrocities, if you will, in terms of malnutrition and starvation and that happened in Southwest Asia in the 70s. All of that is a piker, if you will, to what's happening right now under our noses, under the very bombs and devices that we manufacture to our extreme profit. Understand that that's happening right now. It's on our watch. It's our responsibility. And we as Americans have a responsibility to stand up to this president because he's the president now. Newsflash, CNN is, I watch CNN. I'm not a TV guy. I'm too busy doing this. And, I started watching CNN in the days after the election. And, I don't play the media bias game. I just don't have time to go there. It's nonsense. That's out what we call here at the Coalition outrage porn. But what I see this sort of obsession still with Donald Trump. Donald Trump lost. He's gone. Now there's a new administration. And the new administration made promises upon which they were elected. And one of them was quite simply I'll call it the notion, what they defined as an objective was to immediately withdraw American support, from the outrage that is Yemen. And, there's one young lady in the movement who has started a count up, if you will, to how many days it's been since Mr. Biden's been president and not done that. And as we pointed out in the early moments of the show, sent a clear signal to the anti-war movement, which seems to be almost exclusively there are people out there who feel like we do, but it seems like, a portion of the libertarian movement is mobilized and weaponized, if you will, if I can steal their terms, against this. We seem to be the only people screaming to high heaven about that. That, and of course, a variety of movements surrounding the Quakers. So it's time for us.
And the leftists.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the real leftists, to the people, and by leftists, I mean people, not the left half of America, but to the left of the Democratic Party, where to me, a liberal means a Democrat, but a leftist is a progressive or a socialist or a communist or an anarcho-leftist. And they almost always are committed anti-imperialists and really do mean it and do work hard. So they do deserve credit for that, as separate from the liberals who deserve no credit at all because they're devils and worthless.
There you go. Well, I've got to bring this to a close this evening. First of all, Scott, on relatively short notice, you were able to carve out time from an intense schedule, and I am profoundly grateful for that. Like I said, I'd like to, and I'll get with your folks and you this week, and I'd love to carve out some time in just a week or two or so where we can do a deep dive on your book. I'm one of those guys who actually, if I have someone on who's an author, I actually call me crazy, but I actually read the book, and I actually buy the book.
I'm happy to do it, Pat, anytime.
And again, it's we as libertarians, and I think we can do a deep dive into this next time, but we as libertarians now, post-election, are sort of reassessing, as you want to do after a major election, a 4-year presidential election, as to what our purpose, what our objective, what our meaning is, what our role is, how can we engage and really take parts of our quote unquote philosophy and forward face that to the world. And I can think of no more nobler cause than libertarians everywhere, taking that hard look in the mirror and saying, okay, am I going to argue? And like I said, this is the tease for next time. Am I going to sit and argue with libertarians about how many libertarians you can fit on the needle of a pin? Am I going to engage in endless conversations about long-lost Austrian economists who are important and I believe in thoroughly, but are we going to do that, or are we going to look at the great crisis in the world facing us right now, and are we going to get off our asses and actually do something about it? And that is the challenge that I'm going to bring up, and we'll discuss next time in light of your book, and make this. Let's get lots of people on board. No pride of ownership here. Let's just do it. What did they say? Check your egos at the door. But let's get and mobilize people against what I believe is the single greatest humanitarian life crisis in my life. And I say that because, quite frankly, again, I have seen the enemy and he is us. There's not as much I can do against some foreign power who is allegedly engaged in this type of activity. There sure is one whole hell of a lot I can do as an American taxpayer, an American citizen, an American voter here in our side of the pond, as they're wont to say. There's a lot we can do, and part of it is taking a responsibility onto ourselves and amplifying, having the conversation with people, making the point, exposing the facts, and challenging the authorities, the Solons, the wise men of American foreign policy to just stop it. Because you're right. Doesn't take a pen, doesn't take a sword, doesn't take a vote. One phone call. One call, as they say, does it all, right? So let's, Scott Horton, thank you for joining us tonight. Listen, tell folks where they can find you, where they can get your book, the name of your new book, the name of your last 2 books again. Engage in what we lovingly refer to here on the Coalition Talk Radio at coalitionradionetwork.com. Engage in shameless self-promotion.
Okay, so I'm at libertarianinstitute.org, antiwar.com, and foolserrand.us for the Afghanistan book. And the new book, Enough Already, is at enoughалreadybook.net. And I'm back on the crack that is Twitter at Scott Horton Show.
Excellent. And folks, you'll find not only those links, but you'll find links on and about and around the coalitionradionetwork.com site. We've got a number of books from folks who either joined us or things you must read. And Mr. Horton's books are in that category of things you
I forgot to say,
read.
Pat.
Go ahead.
I forgot to say, I got 5,400 something interviews for you guys, almost all about foreign policy, going back to 2003 at scotthorton.org.
Excellent. Well, folks, it's been a hell of a night. We've analyzed. I'll just leave it this way. There's 2 great issues we discussed tonight. One of which, of course, is the humanitarian crisis that's American-generated in Yemen. we spent a lot of time on this tonight, and there are folks who suffer from what I call short attention span theater, and I know that we did and again, the term for tonight, I guess, is deep dive. I'm out of cliches tonight, but ultimately, this is the difference between independent media and the 1 minute treatment you'll get sanitized on your nightly news and/or the agenda-driven drivel. You like that? Agenda-driven drivel. I just made that up. All right, that you'll see on a couple of the big quote unquote networks, CNN, Fox, OANN, whatever, Newsmax, whatever, who are completely agenda driven. Yet, despite all of that, any one of those organizations has the capacity of, quite frankly, unlimited resources relative to, say, Scott's program, which is very well done, and our little effort here in Rhode Island. So what's the lesson from that? Make your resource-driven listening, watching podcasts like Scott's. We'd like to think that we could play a role in your day-to-day life in terms of information and presenting with you original thought from the folks from whom it emanated. We don't do press release journalism here. And support independent media, because you're not going to have this conversation anywhere else. We are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn, free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Radio Network at coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, on the mighty, mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, the original mothership at Coalition Radio US, where we've got about 7 or 8 years worth of interviews. And of course, now moving forward, we call it Coalition Radio 3.0 here on our new network, which is, we are now 4 nights a week with programming and hoping to grow even more. Folks, please take it personally. Have a wonderful evening. We'll be back tomorrow night. Good night.